It's in a piece called Grounds of Validity of the Laws of Logic. He's trying to say why we should believe that the laws of logic are valid,
Okay.
So, if A contains B and B contains C, then A contains C,
Right.
that kind of stuff. And so he's, actually come up with several different defenses that are interesting. This is somewhat into the paper. But here he's talking about, who was it? Swift, Jonathan Swift, because what he said, he's talking about the syllogism. Now, Peirce is prior to the real explosion in modern logic, even though he contributed to that. So he focuses a lot on the syllogism, but the way he handled it is interesting. But what he's saying is that people have objected to deductive reasoning because it's kind of mechanical.
Right.
He says even Jonathan Swift said pretty much a machine could do that.
Right.
So I'm going to pick up there. Right. It says a much more interesting objection is that a syllogism is a purely mechanical process. It proceeds according to the bare rule of formula, and a machine might be constructed which would so transpose the terms of premises. This being so, and it is so, it is argued that this cannot be thought. So the syllogism can't really be thinking because it's mechanical, which is basically one of the things that Deacon was saying, that if we take the purely computational approach to consciousness, we're missing a lot of what's going on there.
Right. I mean, my own sense would be, and it's Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2 that he did in Thinking Fast and Slow, but it has to do with the associative network is probably primary to computational processes. Computational processes is sort of, I don't want to call it an artificial, but it's a only at intentional directed will, it's sort of it's the kind of thinking that you do, for example, if I say multiply 17 times 34.
Problem solve.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas if I say, the word coconut cream pie, there are countless, suddenly clowns are appearing in your imagination, and there's all kinds of other things.
Yeah, so the criticism here is that the syllogism is worthless because it's not thinking, and, we need to concentrate on thinking. Now, I don't buy that because,
right.
Deductive logic has a service. It's serviceable.
Right. Well, I think he's probably posseing up argument for why abduction is really pretty kick-ass.
He's definitely onto those kind of things. Matter of fact, I just love to read Peirce. But anyway, let me continue here. It says, this being so, it is argued that this cannot be thought, that there is no life in it. Swift has ridiculed this syllogism in his Voyage to La Puta. And I don't know if you're aware, I just always tell people, La Puta in Spanish means the whore, right?
Okay.
So he was, I think it was France or something. Anyway, I don't know a lot about that. But, so he was ridiculed this syllogism by describing a machine for making science. He says, by this contrivance, this is Swift, by this contrivance, the most ignorant person at a reasonable charge and with little bodily labor might write books in philosophy, poetry, politics, law, mathematics, and theology without the least assistance from genius or study. Now, and to me, that's kind of descriptive of what's going on today a little bit, with particularly, for instance, in art. And music. You can create music that will sell on the internet, and you don't know much about music because you're just playing with your computer.
Right.
In a sense.
Well, I don't disagree. I mean, I think today it gets described as garbage in, garbage out. That's...
Yeah. Okay, so now here's Peirce continuing. The idea involved in this objection seems to be that it requires mind to apply any formula or use any machine. If then the mind is itself only another formula because it's syllogistic, right? It requires another mind behind it to set it into operation and so on ad infinitum. And that's the homunculus that Deacon was talking about, right? So Peirce is even kind of has an intuitive glance of that, Right. Then he goes on to say, this is where, to me, it got kind of funny. This objection fails in much the same way that the first one, which we considered, failed. It is as though a man should address a land surveyor as follows, quote, you do not make a true representation of the land. You only measure lengths from point to point, that is to say, lines. If you observe angles, it is only to solve triangles and obtain the lengths of their sides. And when you come to make your map, you use a pencil, which can only make lines again. So you have to do so. I can't read. You have to do solely with lines. But the land is a surface, and no number of lines, however great, will make any surface, however small. You therefore fail entirely to represent the land. Unquote. The surveyor, I think, would reply, "Sir, you have proved that my lines cannot make up the land, and that therefore my map is not the land." This is in
Right.
Was it in the 1860s?
Yeah, I mean, he has Peirce listed in the acknowledged. Really? It's dedicated Science and Sanity. Among the huge number of people that it is dedicated to, it includes Peirce.
Oh wow! So I can let me finish it though. Let's see. My map is not the land. I never pretended that it was, but that does not prevent it from truly representing the land as far as it goes. It cannot indeed represent every blade of grass, but it does not represent that there is not a blade of grass where there is. To abstract from a circumstance is not to deny it. Suppose the objector were at this point to say, to abstract from a circumstance is to deny it. Wherever your map does not represent a blade of grass, it represents there is no blade of grass. And I think that's a good point, right? Because but then of course the reply is the guy goes on to say, I never meant to represent the whole of the territory.
Right. See, now this goes back to what we were just talking about. In Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman, I think is the way he pronounced it, the guy who won the Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics, but he's basically a psychologist, and he was laying out the difference between these two kinds of, we'll call them systematic ways that consciousness operates. And he uses System 1, System 2 just sort of metaphorically, and he doesn't really, he has a lot on why he uses these particular expressions, whatever. But yeah, System 1 is this associative kind of network that works intuitively, often without realizing it, and it does have this sort of property that he calls what you see is all there is. There is a sense of again, that taking the map to be definitive to the territory, to the extent that if it wasn't on the map, well, then it isn't in the territory, right? I mean, that's what you see is all there is. That is one of the basic problems, I guess, of psychology. I think there was a famous study that was done, I guess, I can't think of what it was called, something like the invisible gorilla or the great gorilla or something like this, where the basketball teams, they were taught to watch a ball move around, and some people in counting the number of passes were so attending to the ball that they didn't notice this big gorilla in the screen that's on there for several seconds jumping around. And this became a major study in selective attention, and part of the problem of how the world we perceive is a constructed world driven by goals and orientations, and Well,
that's why eyewitness accounts are so various in the same event and unreliable.
Right. I mean, I was going to go back to the homunculus issue there, and I think part of the problem there is, subjectivity postulated as like an eye behind the scene, highly problematic. But if you start to get at, how could subjectivity be the way that time doubles back upon itself? Could the way that a certain kind of stretching along, which in its stretch is able to take part of its stretching and fold it back upon itself, that I think one can have a sense of subjectivity, and it has to do with the way something like what we're going to call the present integrates and relates what we're going to call the past and the future. And that's, it's sort of like this locus of control which is able to, in the open stretch, relate to what it's able to gather in selective ways and call its past, and to anticipate, imaginatively, what it calls its future. And at no point does it imagine that there's something independent of the sheer stream of time flowing. There doesn't have to be something in addition to that stream. It has to do with the compositional, relational elements and the way they're able to integrate and fold back upon one another. I think there's a line by Alan Wheelis, which it's always stuck with me, and even though it's physicalist, it sort of forces it. He says, man's consciousness is as a man standing before a mirror, asking the man he sees in the mirror what the man in the mirror is asking. And so there's this sense of you saying, what are you asking? And it only makes sense if you have that elongated stretch of time in which you could hang in the delay of asking, what were you asking? I mean, consciousness is almost dazed in its own, its capacity to refract itself by differing rates of change. And those differing rates of change are maybe what we're calling reflection. But I don't think it ever requires something outside of time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I can see, as you're saying this, I'm envisioning, because, up here we have this supposedly this sort of executive function that focuses, and then in the background there's all this, what they used to call emotional limbic system, with and there's those two systems, so where the subjective consciousness is sort of this tight ball floating in this sea of emotion, and much of it comes from the past and is projecting into the future. And I think it almost seems like, as you were saying it, that this tightening of that ball of subjectivity is what, in a sense, creates the subjectivity itself.
Right.
That our ability to focus in on this one thought, so it makes it this one instant.
Right.
Throws out that background of all the other thoughts and all the, that makes it future. And I mean, because clearly, if we didn't have a present, we wouldn't have a past and a future, right?
Right. Well, I think that's right. And I think background becomes either literally or metaphorically synonymous with the past. Here would be the way to come at this, right? Is that, and this has to do with Andy Clark's stuff. I've been reading a lot of Andy Clark stuff. So wonderful. But his stuff on embodied cognition, and it sort of is like this, and it has to do with out here where there's, we're out here at the condo where there's, nothing on the wall, and it's basically empty rooms. And, he says, and he's talking about memory, and he suggests that, one of the vital roles of the way that we, or one of the ways that we diminish the demands on cognitive load is to externalize memory. You put items, like the way you arrange your bookshelves. Just right now, I see that you when you redid your room there, you had to re-put your books there, partly to help you remember where they are. Exactly. But in another sense, what that means is that many of us walk along and imagine ourselves as more stable, less likely to change, because we've stabilized ourselves by putting our memories outside ourselves, and we walk around inside a past that it looks like it's just in the present, but it is. Yeah. It's an externalized memory. And see, I think part of the dynamic there is that a person can more radically change, quotes, themselves, or this sense of who they are, partly by changing their environment. So I guess there's two levels there. So in one sense, you could say that, yes, going back to your original point, it is right that maybe the brain is the wrong word. There's not only two different hemispheres, but there's lots of different components to the brain, and they communicate and interact with one another, maybe at different rates, and I mean literally like different capacities for responding to what they become aware of. That is, some are more hormonal, some are more synaptic, some are more, it has to do with levels of self-relation at different component parts. But I think if some person's going to reduce it to nothing more than brain relation, and they're going to miss how the brain is geared into, what's sometimes called the hodological space of representation, that is, the way that your memory is archived in your environment. And so I think a lot of this, issues of self-relation and reflexivity, it's more than just time flow, like something like an internal time flow. It has to do with the way that we build up pasts in our environments, the way that we use calendars, the way that
what I was going to mention was before writing, speech is not an external memory, right? But once you have writing, then you can create an external memory in that form,
Right.
right? And so,
Well, I guess can you say that again? I guess I'm not.
you know how you're saying we put things into our world, the world around us, so we don't have to remember them. They're cues to our memory. Well,
Right.
writing becomes one of those kinds of things, or
Right.
at least
Well, I mean, I think speech arguably is as well. That speech in
yes,
some
but
way creates objects of reflection where before there were mere perceptions of differences in relation. So
yes,
there's perceptions of differences in relations, but once those get labeled or talked about, they become new objects to be reflected upon in their own right and can be subject to new forms of management once they're objects that are
yeah,
symbolic.
no, I certainly agree. But I was looking at the second step when language becomes written. But
Okay,
you're
right.
right, because I like the fact that Peirce points out that one of his ideas about the significance of a symbol is it allows us to focus, like the word rock or something, or tree. It allows us to focus on that object. And so clearly, what I'm interested in is, when do we start naming ourselves? You know, because once we name ourselves, once we have a word for ourselves, then that can allow us to more focus on that too.
Exactly.
But yeah, and in mythology, when we get together on Christmas, on winter nights, when we can't be outside, and so we tell all these stories about our tribe and all that kind of stuff. That certainly is an external memory.
Exactly.
But it's evanescent, right?
Right. But I mean, I think
Right.
that's a good way to come at it, to say that, I think there are collectivist sense of selves that were generated through narratives partly related to origin stories and to ultimate destination stories, and some sense of communal self was probably, that began. And then literacy relates to a kind of individuating where one can learn one's history in an individuated way, in a personal, privatized
like
way.
me here in my study, or you in your
Right.
study. I could learn all this stuff that before I would have to sit around the campfire, if I want to learn the history of my people.
I mean, I think literacy not only decontextualizes knowledge and makes objects of knowledge radically decontextualizable from space and time, but it deeply individuates the person in a sense that I guess arguably too, it introduces the transition from mythos to history proper.
Yes.
History is what takes place, and now we say you make it into history, which is somehow more real than a mythical in the beginning or something like Once Upon a Time. Like maybe it's the difference between Once Upon a Time and In the Beginning.
Yeah, really. And as a matter of fact, one of my favorite religious writers, Mircea Eliade, he points out that one of the most important characteristics of this mythology is it often starts with something like Once Upon a Time or Back in Those Times. As a matter of fact, the way he always puts it, we make our stone tools the way we do because back in the day, our original ancestor did it that way, And
Right.
so the myths have their own special kind of time, in a sense.
Right.
Which once you start, even if it's a myth, if it's written down and you start reading it,
Right.
It's not the same kind of experience.
And I think that's maybe the problem, is that we're in such a scientific, literal-minded culture that the bankruptcy is the bankruptcy of myth-making rather than of truth-telling. That we're dying of the truth. We're choking of too much truth without having the adequate mythological wrapping in order to help it genuinely make sense. Like I was thinking about, not to try to salvage a literalist theism, but to reintroduce a kind of, a figurative, playful mythology. Like if you say, imagine in the beginning, in the proverbial, Once Upon a Time, there was a young god who didn't even know what a god was. And this young god thought it was very powerful, didn't realize how powerful it was, imagined it was more powerful than it was, got utterly disappointed because it wasn't as powerful as it had first thought, and in its sad disappointment attempted to kill itself, and yet didn't realize its own eternality, and its suicide attempt failed, and it turned into the Big Bang. And now the deity, divested of anything resembling the powers that it originally had, was just left to kind of reassemble itself through the odyssey of time, with however that could happen. The way that you can take a sponge and pulverize it into water, and it slowly comes and reforms itself, however disfigured that might be. But if you imagine, again, if you imagine it as a playful myth, and that there is an afterlife, there is a heaven and a hell, and it's what we are right now. We're caught in the heaven and the hell that God created for itself in its own. I think if people were more willing to entertain such thoughts,
Yeah, but I think what you're really trying to say here is we need a sort of ideology that's bigger than just the facts of life, or what I mean?
Yeah, it's so funny. I don't know if you saw
it. Values system.
There was a recent video by Minute Physics where they were talking about new cosmological, positions in physics suggesting that there is a problem with the Big Bang and that there maybe was multiple Big Bangs. I mean, there's everything from Roger Penrose's stuff, and there's all kinds of different people. But in the video, they're hanging upon some Catholic priest who also happened to be an astronomer who used some of Hubble's.
We're not talking about
observations. Right? You have to see the video. I guess I'll post the link.
Teilhard Chardin, do you know?
What's that?
Are they talking about Teilhard Chardin?
No, it's not Chardin. It's the guy who invented whatever the expression, the Big Bang. And they're sort of hanging the Big Bang expression on, it was a Christian thinker who believed in the beginning. And the video sort of starts, physicists usually began with the idea that the universe was eternal. And then along comes this Christian thinker, a Catholic, who believed that it had a beginning. And using Hubble's, telescope, he came up with what unfortunately became known as the Big Bang. And then they sort of hang this Big Bang theory on a Christian, who then they go, but now physicists are realizing that they were right all along. And the physicists never really believed. It was this sort of, and it's really odd because the whole time you're sort of thinking, why can't we just accept that it's going to have to be mythical at some point?
Yeah, really.
It just so becomes literal minded.
Really, one of the best images in terms of Big Bang, understanding the Big Bang I ever heard of. I went to I audited a seminar of physicists and Christian, theologians at Harvey Mudd Colleges out in Pomona, California, and it was David Bohm. Maybe you're familiar with David Bohm. What he said was, just imagine an infinite ocean where all of these little waves are rippling up constantly. And those are, in a sense, each little wave is a virtual universe in its own right, where it kind of comes up, but no time irreversible processes occur. And so it just goes back down and, so it's going like this. And so you constantly have an infinite sea of universes come virtual. And then just according to him, out of sheer serendipity, at one spot, a whole bunch of little waves come together at the same time, and they make a big splash that creates time irreversible processes, and we have a real universe as opposed to a virtual one.
Right.
But of course, that doesn't happen in just one place because the ocean is infinitely large. It's happening in an infinite different number of spots at any one time. So in that scenario, there are an infinite number of Big Bangs occurring and playing themselves out at any given time.
Right.
Which is certainly a possibility. Now, to me, part of the problem with that scenario is if there's an infinite number of universes, then there will be ones with creatures like us. And that doesn't take any deity behind the scene. You know what I mean? That can be just, in a sense, a physical process. So I'm a little bothered by that. But I like that image of the infinite cosmic. That's what I call the creative resource, that infinite cosmic ocean. It's the background that produces all the Big Bangs.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone ever needs a Big Daddy in the sky or the creator or some omnipotent, omniscient, powerful being who will ensure justice or, virgin births or, resurrections or any of that kind of stuff. I think it's it has to do with this larger question of who am I? We're back to that original question of what, can you answer the question, who am I, in a literal sense, or will that always be impoverished? won't there have to be something like a mythical backdrop for the factual framework?
Yes, and mostly because that's what satisfies the human mind, right? I mean,
Oh, right. And then the people who say, well, yeah, but they only satisfy it because of its evolutionary survival. Like, yeah, but that at this point has just become a myth for people. And it's a sadly literalist myth. Until you get to people like Lynn Margulis and other people who are looking at the eukaryote invasion and the way that, multicellularity and, when you see you see humanity as a kind of biotic film on top of a many, whatever billion-year-old process, and we're, many eyes and many orifices on this film. That's a little better than this weird, individual organism eking out something like a competitive space for itself and surviving. It's really weird,
Yeah, because one is basically, the last one is a stranger in a strange land, whereas Margolis, and that's why I kind of felt that after I was getting into Deacon's book, where I don't feel like a stranger in a strange land anymore.
Right.
I can see how I am, in a sense, one with the universe, because the processes that generated me are these, those the play between the orthograde and contragrade, and all that kind of stuff.
Were we talking about that? I'm trying to think of who I was talking with. That maybe it was a colleague that maybe it was you. That religion is that which is designed to make you feel at home in the world.
And, no, actually, that wasn't me, but yeah, that.
I mean, the idea that religion is not about beliefs, it's not about faiths and this kind of stuff. It has to do with those habits and practices that are explicitly designed to make people feel at home in all of this. Yes. And I think you have to be able to answer, who am I, as part of that.
Yes, and that's why religion was so much more serviceable and functional in the earlier primitive environments, right? Because it was especially with those smaller communities. I mean, hunter-gatherers, you get maybe 200 people in the tribe at the most, and so it's easier to knit all those people together with the mythology and give them a sort of community identity as opposed to the but now it seems to be that to me. Living in Texas, I mean, there's so fucking many churches here, so many Christians, and I see that getting that indoctrination from a very early age gets in the way of developing a more appropriate view of who am I.
Right.
That's why I'm.
Well, and I think in the who am I story that contemporary science tells isn't very helpful. And you could say everything from the problems of the morality of social Darwinism to the fact that we're not even here, we're not even having this conversation. There's just bosons and fermions and there's just particles, and this is an epiphenomenal illusion. I mean, the incoherences within, the number of people who are geoscientists saying we have to do something about climate change and other physicists going, well, there really is no we here. There isn't a coherent narrative. There isn't a coherent story provided by science. They could say evolution, but evolution isn't really part of physics.
No, it's not. And as a matter of fact, that's another thing David Bohm pointed out is that, as a matter of fact, he even laid it on the structure of our language, that it's leading to this fragmentation where, there isn't a coherent story coming out of science. As a matter of fact, he has this one book. I almost brought it up at the conference, but I don't know how familiar people were with it. But I can't even. I think it's called Fragmentation and Wholeness. But in this one text, he creates a new form of language, what he calls the Rheo mode, after the god Rhea in Greek. R-H-E-A means to flow. So in the Rheo mode, he takes all the verbs out.
Right.
And basically, it's something like instead of saying like. Our Father who art in heaven, you would say pan-pateration, the Father of all, pan, all, pater, Father, pan-pateration, celestation, our Father who art in heaven, and so it's not is in anything, it's just, so he's playing with the structure of language to make it more coherent.
Right.
Now, I don't think he believed it would catch on.
No,
but he was trying to point something out.
Well, it's like his wholeness and implicative order, right? I mean, everything is as it is because everything else is as it is. And part of the problem is that once you've broken things up as you have with language, you're caught with the Humpty Dumpty problem. And you almost have to reinvent a language which helps capture the implicate relation of things to things, right? It's sort of what we were getting at earlier with the brain problem. I mean, once people have talked about the brain as if it were a thing, the many-fold reflexive ways that parts relate to other parts and produce what we experience, I mean, that sort of gets glossed over once you cut it up,
Yeah, once you say the brain. Right?
The brain, yeah.
Your brain is thinking that, yeah. It's a very, in fact, it's the most complex organism we've ever, come across.
Yeah, right.
And we have to, but of course, clearly most people are not going to be able to understand it that way. I mean, most people just don't put enough effort into intellectually understand, or that kind of an understanding.
Right.
And that's why I think religion is so popular, because it's just so easy, right?
Right. I mean, I think Bohm even has a lot of the stuff we were talking about. If you look at his book on dialogue, he has a lot on how the new cortex allowed for representational thought in a way that the organisms that don't have those frontal parts their thought isn't reflexive to itself in the same way. I mean, he literally has these, the problems of proprioception. I mean, that's basically what he's arguing, that, your other organs, your body, it naturally has, unless it's damaged, it has proprioceptive capacities, but that cortex, as a late developer, somehow evolved without proprioception as part of its capacity, and you think, and your thought is a movement, but you don't realize your thought as a movement. Like when I move my hand is aware of my hand moving, but my thought moves without feeling itself as a movement and seems to just deal in things and facts without being properly aware of its own movements.
Yeah, and I think that's in part because we don't have pain sensors in the brain, right?
Right.
But we don't have the right. We don't have sensors. I mean, we got obviously neurons in the brain. That's all there is. But they're not monitoring their own behavior in a sense, right? They're just doing their thing. Whereas part of my brain is monitoring the. So I've got receptors out here that allow me to have the ability of proprioception here, but I don't have those kind of physical capacities in there, right?
Yeah.
And
I mean, it just seems like, again, to give the sort of Andy Clark or embodied mind kind of stuff, it must have just taken millions and millions of years of tool use, of various forms of working with the hands, and of somehow integrating the body's ability to reflect upon itself. I could rub my eyes, I could hear my ears, I could have one hand touch another, I could create something and look at what I've created, and all those things slowly gave rise to that chord over millions of years.
Yes. If you look at the history of tools, right, the first the tool set is called Oldowan, from the area in Africa where Leakey found, and that tool set does not change for a million years. And then the second one comes in. It's the was it a Chulian, or I can't remember. The second phase comes in, and it lasts for almost a million years. And so progress at the very beginning is extremely slow, right? And so we have 2 million years of just basically one change in tool use of doing the same thing over but clearly there has. And as a matter of fact, once in the next stage, the tools become much more. As a matter of fact, from the first stage to the second stage, the first stage is you take a rounded stone from the stream and you chip off till you get a sharp edge on it, and there's no design in a sense. The second stage is actually the symmetrical hand axe, where now there's a little bit of art in there, right? The symmetry, and that's the one that lasts for almost a million years. And then the third stage is introduction of smaller tools and doing more things. And to me, once you get more tools, you have to start talking about those things.
Yeah, cognitively representing them. Yes.
Way. What's that? I'm sorry?
Cognitively representing them.
Yes, because especially when you're trying to teach your kid how to do it.
Right.
With the simplest stone tools, he watches you, and but once you get certain techniques of pressing off just small flakes to get a particular shape and all that kind of stuff, language becomes very handy.
Right. No, I agree.
So,
I think Jared Diamond places language back like a million years or something, whereas most people are much more conservative. They'll put language, 30,000 or a half. Yeah. They'll put it like 500,000, maybe a 500,000. That's pretty. That's very That's pretty high. But he'll put it at like 1 million.
Yeah, I would agree myself, because at oh, hold on, that's my kid calling me. Hello, what's up? Um, oh yeah, I can't see Homo erectus, which 1 million years ago. I can't see them not talking to each other, and now clearly they don't have what I think occurred 50,000 years ago. Maybe is modern syntax.
Yeah.
Not language. I believe language existed 1 million years ago, and it was a very basic language for sort of pointing and naming, or I don't know what. I don't want to conjecture even. Right. But I can't see them living that lifestyle without using some type of a verbal communication.
Yeah, I mean, the thought of, fire goes back 1 million.
Yes.
The thought of no fire, or the thought of language with no fire is, or
fire with no language.
Fire with no language. Yeah, it almost doesn't make sense. It almost doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
Well, it depends on what we mean by language and I guess all that other stuff. But I think maybe the point that I was just going to try to underscore is that there's certainly very sophisticated representational capacities in just perceiving the world and learning to pay attention to things and discerning edible fruits from non-edible fruits and certain kinds of flowers and whatnot. But that's so different than learning to discern as you create something. The kind of perceptual process of handling and creating, see, that's the reflexivity that I'm sort of talking about. I mean, it's one thing to integrate the hand and the foot by way of chasing something and trying to grab it, but it's still some external object that is out there. But once I start to create it and I'm handling it, it's as if I think about it in a different way. I'm anticipating what I'm going to do with it, not what it's going to do. And it introduces this doubling back upon itself. That is somehow its outcome as under my control as opposed to its outcome is something I'm trying to control. Like it's hard for me to get at that. There's a fine flip over that happens though.
And actually what I just saw when you were saying is that as I'm making this stone tool, if my child is watching me do this, I'm communicating through this stone tool to where, in a sense, it will, it almost becomes a word for me, or like a word, right? It's something that I make that means something to somebody else.
Right.
Right. And so maybe I can make something with my mouth that means something to somebody else. Right. Just make a sound and have, and then so that tool development and I think speech come into existence hand in hand.
Oh yeah, hand in hand, literally.
Yeah, this is interesting shit.
Well, it's good stuff. So hey, I'm gonna stop. I tried to record